Welcome. We appreciate you joining with us to watch this message. We pray it will bless you, that we'll all learn, grow, and become more like Jesus. Let's join in watching the message at this time.
At the age of 14, Mary Nelson's mom committed suicide, and Mary went to the streets to begin working as a prostitute. At the age of 18, she moved to Hawaii, hoping to start again on her life. But when she got to Hawaii, she went back to the streets and continued in the same profession. When she was in her early 50s, Christians at Blue Water Mission persuaded her to leave her street life and begin working at their restaurant that the church operated called Seed. Mary worked as a dishwasher, intentionally staying in the back in the kitchen area to avoid what she called the good people that would come visit the restaurant as patrons. But after 6 months of being in the back and the work of the people there at the church, Mary began finding a new life. She said, and I quote, "I get to be the person I was never able to be. I get to help people without someone trying to take advantage of me." End quote. Nelson added that she now earns as much in 1 month as she earned in 1 night on the street. And that life on the street was very different. She said that she had brand new cars, jewelry, travel, and a whole lot of nice condos. But along came with that was beatings, rape, and the other problems that come along with the street life. She says of her life today, and I quote, "You cannot buy what I'm going through right now. I never thought I'd be this person I am now." End quote. Mary Nelson got a second chance of life, and she took that chance. Not everyone who gets a second chance decides to take it, but Mary did. Now, if you followed us for the past couple weeks, you know that we are continuing with our epic journey as we travel through the Bible, and we're today in our third message of the Exodus series. So far, we've learned that Moses was born at a time when Israel was slaves in Egypt. They were captive in Egypt. And the Israelites kept reproducing and the population kept growing. So Pharaoh offered an edict that said all the male babies would be thrown into the Nile, basically crocodile feed. It was during this time that Moses was born. But when he was born, his mother Jochebed and his father Amram saw that Moses was no ordinary child. And so they saved him, they hid him for 3 months. And if you've ever tried to keep a baby quiet and hide him for 3 months, you find that's impossible. And so at the end of 3 months of that time period, Jochebed, his mother, took a basket of papyrus and lined the inside with pitch and tar, and then placed baby Moses in it and placed the basket in the reeds along the Nile River. And through providence, the daughter of Pharaoh found baby Moses, and Moses ended up being a prince of Egypt. One day, 40 years though, after Moses was born, he was out watching the slaves work, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, which angered Moses. Moses killed that Egyptian and buried him in the sand. And when Pharaoh found out about it, Moses fled for his life. He went to the wilderness area of the land of Midian. There he met his future wife, married her, and they had 2 children. One day the Lord appeared to Moses in the form of a burning bush, a bush that did not burn. And thus we come to today's message, the God of second chances. Some Bible scholars think that when Moses was in Egypt and killed that Egyptian, some scholars think that Moses knew at that time that he was their Redeemer, that he would be the one to rescue and save the Israelites. But the problem was, if Moses did know that, he was trying to get ahead of God. God wasn't ready for Moses to lead yet, and so as many of us know, that sometimes when we try to do things God's way, when it's not God's timing, it doesn't work very good. Moses had attempted to do things his way rather than God's way. And with that strike on Moses, God removed Moses from leadership in Egypt and took him to the wilderness, where he spent the next 40 years. It's been said that God had to get Moses out of Egypt so that God could get the Egypt out of Moses. That took another 40 years. Moses needed humbling. Moses needed to learn who the God of Israel was. Moses needed to understand that God was in charge. And I think you and I can relate with this also. That many times we try to take charge, that we want things our way, even though we may be doing God's will. It still doesn't work to do it our way. We have to do it God's way and understand Him and His way. So let's begin reading Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now, if you remember from last week's message, we had 4 points of why God took Moses into the wilderness. He took Moses in the wilderness to get his attention, number 1. Number 2, he took Moses into the wilderness to teach Moses. Number 3, he took Moses into the wilderness to rebuild Moses. And number 4, God took Moses into the wilderness to bless him. And we're going to talk about these first 3 today because we see this now in Moses' life as God is working with him. First of all, God takes us and Moses into the desert to get our attention. So for the past 40 years, God had Moses' attention in the wilderness. How many times might Moses have reminisced about his good life in Egypt? The life of luxury, the life of power, the life of leadership, and maybe even the life of leisure. But if Moses did reminisce on that and remember those days, it was likely a problem because God needed to get all of that out of Moses to forget that kind of life. And now, after 40 years, Moses no longer had those aspirations. How do we know? Well, we'll continue to read here pretty soon and see that Moses got a little bit stubborn of doing things God's way. So God had to get Moses' attention. Number 2, God takes us, and he took Moses into the wilderness to teach him. One of the things that the Egyptians abhorred, loathed, was shepherding. And what did God do with Moses? He taught him how to be a shepherd. So Moses was in the wilderness. God had his attention. He was learning. And then third, God takes us, and he took Moses into the wilderness to rebuild us and Moses. God had Moses' attention. God taught Moses a simpler life. And Moses also learned about God. He was being taught by God. And part of that learning came through his father-in-law, Jethro. Now, if you remember from last week, part of what we learned was that the father-in-law of Moses was Reuel. And today we learned it's Jethro. Well, same man, just by being called by two different names. And so now that God is talking to Moses out of the burning bush, we learn that God now has his attention in the intense rebuilding. The intense training would begin. See, Moses had his high school degree, we might say, and now the undergraduate, the master's and the doctorate degree was about to begin. God had his attention in that bush that did not burn. And God began to talk with Moses with great intensity. God told Moses, he said, I've heard the cry of the Israelite slavery. And God was about to bring his people out of that land of Egypt, because he was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the great ancestors of the Israelite people. Let's pick up the conversation of God and Moses in verse 10 of Exodus chapter 3. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And as we continue to get into Exodus further on, we're going to learn that once Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt through the Red Sea, that God brought them back to Mount Horeb, which we know better as Mount Sinai. After Moses fled Egypt, or that I should say that fleeing of Egypt was the pivotal point of Moses' life, the first pivotal point. His fleeing and going into the wilderness, marrying, having children. And now at the burning bush, we come to the second pivotal point of Moses' life, when God got his real attention and said, okay, Moses, we're going to begin this intense rebuilding. So now, Moses is 80 years old, and God is starting to talk to him, saying, Moses, you're the one. You're going to lead the Israelites out. Now, I'm paraphrasing what I'm saying, but basically, Moses said, me? Why me? See, God had done such a fantastic job of humbling Moses that now Moses was content. He no longer wanted to go back to Egypt. He was comfortable. He was content. And that's our point. Comfortableness and contentment equal laziness. Comfortableness and contentment equals laziness. You see, when we get comfortable, we get content, and we don't want to change. God says, we're going to change. We're going to do things differently. Come on, let's go. And we say, not maybe verbally, but in our minds, no. I'm comfortable. I'm content. I'm not going to go. And that equals laziness. When we look at the life cycle of congregations, we see a distinct pattern. When a group of Christians forms a new congregation, they come together and they're excited, they're vibrant, and they're telling everybody that they know about the congregation, about Jesus. They're working hard and the numbers begin to grow. There's a lot of excitement in that. They're alive. And then they realize that they need to grow more. And so over the years, they're bringing new people in, and the family is growing. They're becoming a bigger congregation. And after several years, this little congregation is now a decent-sized congregation. They can afford to have a full-time minister, maybe a full-time youth minister, maybe even an associate minister, maybe a song leader. They're They've reached where they want to be. They think they've reached maturity, and then they grow comfortable. They grow content. This may not happen in the first or even second generation, but eventually down the road, they get lazy because they like where they're at. It's a stage of life when the people look back and they say, well, remember the good old days. They remember the work. They remember the attendance and the victories for Jesus. They remember their giant leaps of faith, the sacrifices of money and their sacrifices of labor. But then over the years, they became comfortable and they became content. In many cases, they're like a close-knit family. Now, that's good, except when visitors come into sometimes into these churches, the visitors don't get accepted into the family. This is why when we have fellowship meals, I like to eat last. I like to go through the line last. Because oftentimes I'll see somebody sitting by themselves, and oftentimes it's the new people. Everybody else goes to their families or their friends or whatever, and many times it's some of these new people that we see sitting by themselves. And that's why, eating last, I get to go visit with them and try to make them feel more welcome. But see, when we do this too much, that means that new people, visitors, don't feel like they're part of the family, and we unintentionally push them out. Now, I don't really see this in this congregation, but this happens in many congregations. This is something that we need to remain to be aware of. And then the congregation begins slowly dying. It's a long, slow death when all this begins to happen. And it doesn't only happen to congregations, it also happens to us in our Christian lives. When we're new Christians, we're all excited, we're on board for Jesus, we're telling everybody, and then we look around and we see other Christians that they're not that on fire. They're not bringing other people to Jesus, and so we get comfortable. We get lazy. This was Moses. And this describes many of us. Moses became comfortable. He became content. Moses enjoyed shepherding. Hard work, yes, but on the other hand, out in nature, enjoying God. He had a wife and children that he loved. Why complicate his life? And see, this is you and me a lot of times. God, why complicate my life? I like it right where I am. God has other ideas, though. See, Moses began making excuses to God. Why me? Who shall I tell him sent me? Well, we go to Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Moses kept making excuses. Basically, he was stalling, hoping that if he can stall God long enough, God will decide to use somebody else. God doesn't work that way. When God makes his mind up, he wants to do what he wants to do. And we don't like it when God gets upset. And let's not forget, let's give Moses a little slack here, though. We have to remember that when he left Egypt, he was a fugitive. Pharaoh wanted Moses dead. And so maybe Moses was a little bit frightened to go back to Egypt. But there again, when we're afraid of something, that means that we're comfortable, we're content. Why upset the apple cart? Why get in a precarious situation when I can just stay out of the limelight and I can just be where I am and be lazy? Moses had gotten lazy, and we get lazy too. Moses continued with his excuses. He said, what if they don't believe me? God said, okay, Moses, tell you what, that staff you got in your hand, throw it to the ground. Moses threw it to the ground, and the staff became a snake, a live snake, and my guess, probably a venomous snake. Then God said, Moses, pick up that snake by its tail. Now, if you know anything about snakes, you never pick a snake up by the tail because it can coil around and bite you. But Moses obeyed God. He picked the snake up by the tail, and the snake became a staff once again. God said, Moses, put your hand in your cloak. And he put it in. He said, now pull it out. And when he pulled it out, it was leprous. A disease back then. You did not want to get leprosy. Maybe we could compare it today with skin cancer. You don't want skin cancer. God said, Moses, put your hand back in your cloak. And he did. Pulled it back out. Completely healed. See, God was showing Moses that God was going to be with Moses and showing Moses the power. Moses said, but I'm not eloquent at speech. I'm slow of speech. God promised Moses that he would help him. But Moses moaned on. We go to Exodus chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. But Moses said, and notice his politeness, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. Moses had now complained to the point that God became angry with him. Moses cried out he wasn't smart enough. But with God on your side, how can you go wrong? God was going to provide. He would provide wisdom. Moses would learn as he would go, and God was going to be with him. God had Moses' back. Moses bemoaned that the people would not listen to him. In other words, Moses needed credentials. What did God say? He said, you don't need a degree. You don't need a degree in leadership. You don't need a doctorate degree of education. Just tell the people, I am sent you. God was Moses' credentials. Moses lamented that he could not speak fluently in public. And God says, no problem. I'm going to have your younger brother Aaron come to you and he will speak for you. And if you know the book of Exodus, Aaron did speak for Moses at first, but then eventually Moses started speaking for himself. God was with him. God was training him. Moses learned he could do these things. Moses complained that he wasn't qualified. But God was with Moses. God would train Moses. Now, let's not get too quick to point our finger at Moses, because you and I are very much the same way. Bill Hybels years ago wrote a book called Just Walk Across the Room. In other words, when you're at a party, you're at a gathering, you're in public, or you're with a family, and you see someone that you get that nudge, that spiritual nudge, you need to go talk to that person. And what do? Many times we don't. We don't want to. We might even miss an opportunity. See, we're lazy. We're comfortable where we are. We're content. And God says, no, go walk across the room, go talk to that person. Maybe just be a friend to them. Maybe tell them about Jesus. Maybe comfort them. Talk to them. They may be hurting in some way. See, there's all kinds of reasons that God may say, walk across that room. And we don't like to do it many times any better than Moses. We're afraid. We're comfortable. We're content. But see, we're going to blow it. All of us do blow it. Moses blew it. But see, here's our point. God offers each of us second chances. God offers each of us second chances. And you know what? If we blow the first chance, God will give us a second chance. If we blow the second chance, God usually gives us a third chance. Or maybe a fourth chance or a fifth chance. Now, I don't know how many chances God will give us, but I'm pretty sure He gives us many, many chances. It's just, we just don't want to listen. We keep missing out on the opportunities that He gives us. Maybe we're too scared, but it doesn't matter, because here's the second part of our point. God offers each of us second chances, and God enables us to obey. God enables us to obey. Are you frightened? God will be with you. He'll give you strength. And you know what? Maybe even if you take that second chance and you blow it, maybe that's a learning experience. It might be God saying, okay, now you know what you need to improve on. Go work on it, and then we'll give you another chance. See, don't mess with God. Don't give Him excuses, because He will provide. And sometimes we learn best if we stumble. But there's a problem. Many times we don't hear the chances that we have. Sometimes it's like, well, I missed it, God. I didn't hear it. Well, back in the days when telegraph was the best way of sending messages long distance, a job opening came up for a Morse code operator. So it was an advertisement, so several young men went to this place of business and applied for the job. This one young man walked in the door and he saw the sign that applicants, please fill out this paper, take a seat, and you'll be notified. So this young man went in, he took a paper, he filled it out, and he's sitting there. And pretty soon he got up, walked through a door to an inner office, and disappeared. Now there were 7 other applicants that had been there before him, and they all looked at each other like, well, who does he think he is? And they assumed that he was going to get kicked out. The applicants hadn't talked to each other, but now they begin to talk. How did this guy think he has the audacity to go in ahead of us? And as they were talking amongst themselves, they were expecting him to get thrown out, but pretty soon out came the employer and this young man as a new employee. The employer looked at the guys that were sitting there and said, we've found our man, you can all go home. They looked at each other like, what's going on? Wait a minute, he was the last one here. We were here first. You didn't even give us a chance. One young man was brave enough to ask, how's come you hired him without interviewing us? The employer explained that when they were sitting there, there was this clicking in the background. That clicking was Morse code. That clicking instructed them that whoever understood the code to please enter through the door for the interview. And that one young man was the only one that recognized that it was Morse code, and he got the job. How many times do you and I miss God's calling? See, God calls us in several ways. He calls us through His Word in the Bible, through His Spirit, the Holy Spirit, through Christian friends. But as we read the Old Testament especially, we see that God calls us in very unique ways, such as talking donkeys. Donkeys that actually talked, at least one in the Bible. Sea creatures that swallow people whole and spit them back out on the ground 3 days later. God speaks through visiting angels. God speaks through a star on a dark night, announcing the birth of His Son. Or in this case today, God talks through a burning bush. But if you're not alert, you'll miss these things. Think about that star of Bethlehem. How many thousands of people missed it, but the Magi saw the star and they recognized it to follow. We go back to Mary Nelson, lived the life of a street lady. And she heard the call of the church and began working in the restaurant and turned her life around. And then Mary began helping other people, turning their lives around. Are you alert to the signs that God is giving you? Do you hear? He is calling you. Maybe not right this instant, but yesterday, later today, tomorrow. God is calling you and me. God was calling me into ministry for years and years and years until finally I woke up and accepted the challenge. What's God calling you to do? It might be just to walk across the room and tell somebody about Jesus. It might be to tell a neighbor, a coworker, to take that chance to actually talk to your coworker about Jesus, even if you're not supposed to. How is God calling you, and do you hear Him? And when you do hear Him, will you answer? Or are you going to give a lot of excuses? Let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, oh, how blind we are to you. Our ears are stuffed and we don't hear. We're oblivious to you calling us. But you know what, God? I think that most of us know when you call. Most of us know when you're telling us to do something. It's just that we're like Moses. We start giving you all kinds of excuses. Well, I don't want to do that, God. I'm too busy. I'm too old. Hey, Moses was 80 years old and spent the next 40 years leading the Israelites. Age is not an excuse. Youth is not an excuse. Education is not an excuse. Because we can work. You can lead. We can follow. You can teach us. You didn't say it was going to be easy. Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow. That's not easy, but it's rewarding and it's worth it. And we know that Moses eventually followed and became the friend of God. That you and him had a tight, close relationship. So, Father, help us to hear and help us to follow. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for watching the message. If we can help you in any way, we ask that you please contact us. Check us out on our website at roscopchurch.org. You can find the information there, how to contact us. We'd love to hear from you, talk with you, and help you in your walk with Jesus. Thank you once again for joining with us.